Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over the money market. In today's lesson overview, we're going to review the opportunity cost. We're going to review the opportunity cost of holding money. We're going to graph the money demand curve and correspondingly the money supply curve as well. And then we're going to determine what causes the money demand curve to shift to the left here. And I'll list them right here. Changes in the aggregate price levels, changes in real GDP, changes in technology, and changes in institutions. And then finally, we're going to examine this liquidity preference model of the interest rate. So the money market graph, that's going to be something that you're going to be expected to know on FRQ responses, graph the money market, and then they'll give you different situations. So this lesson is designed to get you prepared to be able to answer this for the free response here. So the opportunity cost of holding money. The decision to hold on to cash has an opportunity cost. Okay, it's money that can't be used to invest in other assets. Just like anything else, every choice has a cost. Every choice has an opportunity cost. Well, the decision to hold on to money, it carries this opportunity cost, right? So yes, I do want to, if I had $1 million, I'd love to hold on to $1 million in cash. I might do so. But for me to hold on to that amount of cash, there's an opportunity cost, because instead of holding on to that $1 million, I could put it into the bank, maybe keep it in a CD to gain at least 2 or 3% interest, right? So there is an opportunity cost of holding money in cash. So when we're talking about the money market, we're really talking about holding into money, into cash, or putting it into an interest-bearing account. So for all intents and purposes, theoretically, you could put that money into the stock market. Problem with the stock market is you have variable returns, and it's hard to pinpoint a specific interest rate. So we'll determine as being the interest rate the alternative to holding on to cash, other interest-bearing accounts, short-term interest-bearing accounts like CDs. So to go back a couple of years, in June 2007, the federal funds rate was 5.25%. So the rate at which banks borrow from other banks is at this 5.25%. Well, in June 2008, the federal funds rate dropped to 2.0%. Okay, and in June 2009, the federal funds rate was set to this 0.0 to 0.25%. So in 2007 to 2009, you can argue that the opportunity cost of holding on to money, it decreased dramatically, because in 2007, the idea is that with interest rates fairly high, there was incentive to hold your money in non-cash. Now with interest rates at 0%, the incentive to put your money in interest-bearing accounts, and maybe you're giving up some liquidity, you don't have as much of an incentive. So at these lower interest rates, you're a little bit more indifferent between holding on to cash versus interest-bearing accounts. Whereas at higher interest rates, the opportunity cost gets higher. Again, I think maybe if you have conceptually hard time figuring this out, think of it this way here. Let's use a really extreme case. Let's say you get 1% interest versus 100% interest. These are two big extremes here. In what case are you gonna, really hold on to your money and not really care whether it's in interest accounts or cash? Chances are that 1%, because you're giving up. If you have $100 and you hold on to cash rather than keep it into a bank with an interest-bearing account, you'll have $101 rather than that $100. But if you hold on to cash, you're giving up making an additional $100. So that's $200 that you could have. So you're going to make sure you're going to not hold on to cash when interest rates are much higher. So again, the opportunity cost is extremely high when you have high levels of interest. And again, as I mentioned before, the interest rate you get on cash is 0%, 0.0%. You don't get any interest. If you hide your money under the mattress, you're not going to get any interest with that, because you have it in cash, so it's good. It's extremely liquid, but you're not going to get any interest off of that. So in this case, the opportunity cost of money has decreased over that 2-year time span. All right, so the money demand curve. So you have the interest rate here and you have the nominal quantity of money. And they're inversely related here. Inversely related meaning that as the interest rate goes up, then the quantity demanded for money is going to go down. So again, let's use some examples right here. This graph's already drawn out for you. So let's say, again, nominal quantity, let's call this point 1 million. So maybe there's $1 million in the economy when the interest rate is 10%. Okay, and we lower the interest rate to 5%, and let's call this 1.5 million. So the quantity of money in the economy, and let's lower it even further. Let's call this, 2%, and now the money supply has gone up to, let's say, 2.5 million. Again, the specific numbers aren't really that important, just this inversely related idea. As interest rates go down, the quantity of money is going to increase. As interest rates go up, the quantity of money is going to decrease. So this is the relationship when you're looking at this money demand. Now, what could cause the shift of the money demand curve? So again, make sure you understand the difference between change in quantity demanded for money versus a change in demand. So what changes the quantity demanded is interest rates. So as interest rates move up and down, that changes the quantity demand, but it doesn't change the demand. So again, this is something when you're dealing with supply and demand graphs, a change in the price of Coca-Cola does not change the demand for Coca-Cola. It's something other than the price that has to change in order for that to happen. So there are four different reasons why there might be a shift in the money demand curve. So let's go over at least two of them right now. One would be changes in aggregate price level. Others is a change in real GDP. And they're somewhat related, but we'll go over it. So higher prices have led to an increase in the demand for money. And very simple reasoning here. So the demand for money is proportional to the price level. So if prices rise by 10%, then the demand increases by that same amount. So for example, if the price level goes up, so let's say I'm used to prices of hamburgers being $5. I'm used to the price of pens being 50 cents. I'm used to the price of rent being $1,000. So everything is pretty stable. And let's say everything goes up by 10%. Well, then my cash holdings will also go up by 10%. So my demand to hold on to cash with higher price levels, when I'm buying a burger, I'm going to want to have $5.50 on hand. So the amount of cash I'm going to want to have on hand is going to correspondingly increase. So again, this is this idea, this theory behind this demand curve. Now again, it might not necessarily be very noticeable over the course of 1 year even. I mean, in 1 year, it's very unlikely that 2% increase in prices is going to directly impact your willingness to have 2% more in cash. But compare this year to 1930, definitely people hold on to more cash than they did in 1930. Because the value has really eroded over time, so more money is going to be required to get that same purchasing power. Another reason would be changes in real GDP. So as real GDP increases, the larger quantity of money that households and firms will hold. Very similar, again, as people buy more stuff, as the GDP increases and increases, again, that's going to increase our demand to hold on to cash because, with these purchases. Now, in this modern day and age when purchases are made through credit cards, and who knows in the future, maybe through Bitcoin, this might change a little bit. But, for now, when there's a change in real GDP, again, hard to make that connection from 1 year to the next. But if you look back years and years, this change in real GDP is going to impact how much cash you're going to have on hand. Another reason would be change in technology. So this one's actually interesting. Let's go back to it. Also changes in institutions here. You would normally think, at least for me, the common sense answer is, okay, there's an increase in technology. So, there should be an increase in money demand, but actually works the opposite. When there's an increase in technology, like let's say there's an ATM, there's only one ATM at your bank, but now they put ATMs everywhere. Okay, then what it does is it makes access to money a lot easier. And so the availability of ATMs and widespread acceptance of credit purchases actually decreases the money demand. So why hold on to cash when you know all these different places are gonna take credit card and they're gonna have cash available for you? So I generally don't like holding on to a lot of cash because I know a lot of places are gonna take credit cards. So what's the purpose of holding on to these large amounts of cash? And if you go to a restaurant, in this day and age, I would say the vast majority of Americans, at least, will use credit cards or debit cards over cash. Simply, holding on to large amounts of cash, again, it incurs an opportunity cost, and also it's a little inconvenient to do that. With ATMs, back before there were a lot of ATMs and a lot of bank locations, people would have to maybe make a trek out to the bank, and they would withdraw large sums of money. They would have to withdraw large sums of money in order to, avoid having to go back. But nowadays, people will go to bank, maybe every day, every other day, because it's fairly convenient. There's a Chase Bank in every, three different Chase banks as you go home. And so not many people live in this cash-based society. Interesting story, actually. Bob Dole one time was audited by the IRS because he made these large cash withdrawals. And so the IRS was kind of wondering, what's the deal? And it turned out that it was absolutely legal. There's nothing, Bob Dole wasn't taking any political contributions. He just, took out a large amount of cash, and he actually used that to make his purchases. So, Bob Dole, World War II veteran, he's kind of this old school mentality of how money works, taking out large amounts of cash and spending that. And, there's still Americans that view money that way, but with the availability of all these different technologies, ATM accessibility, credit card acceptances, there's not many places out there that don't accept credit card. And as that becomes more prevalent of businesses, this attitude of accepting credit, the willingness to hold on to cash and incur the opportunity cost, people decide, why hold on to cash? So the quantity demanded for cash, or the demand for cash, I'm sorry, not the quantity demanded, but the demand for money is actually going to decrease with the increase in technology. And finally, this isn't going to be a huge thing, but it's good to know. Regulation Q barred interest-bearing checking. So when this was eliminated in 1980, the money demand shifted to the right. Okay, so when interest-bearing checking accounts was now actually allowed, then basically the demand for money, people are gonna hold more money because they don't have this restriction, so that increased the money demand. Okay, so money and interest rates. Let's see what the relationship is here. But again, the Federal Open Market Committee, or the FOMC, they're in charge of setting this target federal funds rate. Remember, they don't actually set the federal funds rate. They either buy or sell government securities to get the federal funds rate to where their target is. So again, the Federal Reserve doesn't actually set the federal funds rate by fiat. They don't just say, okay, the federal funds rate will now be 2%. There's a mechanism and process that they do to ensure that target rate. So the open market desk at the New York Fed, they buy or sell bonds in order to achieve the target. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the Fed, the Federal Reserve District at New York, they hold the special place. They're the ones that are the permanent members on the FOMC. So as such, they're charged with buying and selling government securities. So if the Fed raises the federal funds rate, then the New York Fed, they're going to sell bonds. They're going to contract the money supply so that the target rate gets to its desired rate. If they lower it, which they can't really lower it when it's at 0%, but when they do lower it, they buy more bonds. As I mentioned before, when the Fed wants to use expansionary monetary policy, when the federal funds rate is 0%, they've had to resort to quantitative easing, where they're directly injecting money, they're buying assets, illiquid assets. They're trying unconventional ways. So again, when the Fed lowers the federal funds rate, other short-term interests, for example, CD rates, they fall in a corresponding manner. It's very predictable. So if the Fed raises rates, well, guess what? Then the rates for a lot of these other rates are going to go up as well. But again, the Fed doesn't actually control these long-term rates. They're doing the best they can to try to influence them, but they don't direct mortgage rates. I mean, the Fed, if they want to keep mortgage rates down, it's very simple. Let's keep the federal funds rate low. But if they want to raise the mortgage rates for some reason, which generally in this type of atmosphere, the Fed probably doesn't want to do that. But if they raise the federal funds rate to from 0 to 2%, then mortgage rates will probably, again, there's no guarantee, because these long-term rates are influenced by the short-term rates, probably go from 4 to maybe 6%. But again, it's no guarantee. So again, in this era of a 0% federal funds rate, the opportunity cost of holding onto money is about as low as you can get. So you can argue there's a lot of cash floating around, more so than before, because there's not a lot of interest-bearing accounts. And again, for the month of January in 2014, the stock market, NASDAQ, dropped 7%. So if people don't want to take a whole lot of risk, they might be holding a lot of their money in cash because the interest rates are low. Other assets may be a little bit risky. So, some people might be holding on to a lot of cash, definitely more so than if interest rates were higher. So this liquidity preference model, we'll go ahead and kind of elaborate a little bit further, but it's very simple. The idea that people want to have access to money. So this liquidity preference idea. So what is this liquidity preference model of the interest rate? So when you look at this here, the interest rate in the money market is determined by the supply and demand for money. So there's a money demand that is downward sloping, and then you combine the money demand, which is again downward sloping, with the MS, which is the quantity of money supplied by the Federal Reserve. And what that is going to be, it's going to be a vertical line that's straight down. So you combine the money demand and money supply curve, and the intersection is where you get this equilibrium interest rate and the amount of money that is actually in the economy here. So the Fed can either increase or decrease the money supply by using one of its three monetary policy tools. And we discussed this using either open market operations, changing reserve requirements, and lending through the discount window here. And I'll go ahead and show you specifically what the impact is, and we'll be able to draw it out in an example. But when the Fed uses open market operations, for example, if it buys bonds, then the money supply shifts to the right. If it sells bonds, then the money supply shifts to the left. Okay, because again, buy bonds will bloat, will increase the money supply. Sell bonds will shrink. Sell bonds will shrink the money supply, so the money supply will shift to the left. Or the Fed can either, raise the RRR, and it will, the money supply will lower, and it can either lower the RRR, and the money supply, when it raises the money supply shifts to the left. When it lowers RRR, the money supply shifts to the right. Okay, and then finally, lending through the discount window, if they raise the discount rate, the money supply again shifts to the left. If they lower the discount rate, then the money supply is going to shift to the right. Again, these are the three conventional monetary policy tools that the Fed will use to alter the interest rate. So equilibrium in this money market. How do you set this equilibrium here? So again, you have you have here's the interest rate labeled as R, and then on the bottom here's the quantity of money. Okay, so that's the labeling that you want to use. And you have this downward sloping, again you can kind of curve it if you want here, but if you have this downward sloping here, label this as MD. Now, again, a common mistake that you might see on the FRQ is that a student draws a downward sloping line and they just put the demand curve. Well, is that gonna actually affect, is that gonna change the answer? I mean, if you have just the demand, again, you want to know for sure that you have the right answer. So if you put MD, you know that you're gonna be right. Whereas if you just put demand curve, there would be some graders that might not actually give you the credit here. Now, the money supply is going to be a straight vertical line down. Because again, the idea is that the Fed controls this money supply, so they can either increase it or decrease it, but it's going to be, either way, it's going to be a straight vertical line down. So MS here. So you have the intersection of MS and MD, and you have the equilibrium interest rate. So let's label this R1 here. And then you have the equilibrium quantity of money here. So this is how the equilibrium is determined in the money market, the interaction between the money supply and the money demand. So example number 1, show on a money demand curve what would happen if short-term interest rates increased from 2 to 5%. So what's going to happen to the quantity demanded for money? So again, let's draw this graph here. So here on the x-axis, you're going to have the quantity of money. On the y-axis, you're going to have R, which is representing the interest rate here. And you have the money demand curve. Okay, keep in mind, this is the nominal interest rate here. So this is the money demand. And again, we're only looking at the money demand here. I mean, we could draw the money supply, but we just want to know, show on the money demand curve, what would happen if short-term interest rates increase from 2 to 5%. So let's put that 2 to 5% here. So let's say this is 2% here. And then let's say this here is 5%. So if short-term interest rates increase from 2 to 5%, then you'd have a corresponding movement along the money demand curve. Now notice I didn't say change in demand, but movement along the money demand curve. So what you would have is that the quantity demanded for money would decrease. Because what happened to the opportunity cost of holding on to money? Opportunity cost is now increased, right? So if there's an increase in opportunity cost of holding on to money, instead of, again, let's use hypothetical numbers here. Instead of $5 million in circulation, now it's going to drop to like $2 million. So the opportunity cost of money increases from 2 to 5%. So the quantity demanded of money is going to decrease. Conversely, if interest rates are lowered, you're going to see an increase in the quantity demanded for money. Okay. So which of the following will decrease? So which of the following situations will decrease the demand for money? Okay. An increase in interest rates. Will that decrease the demand for money? Now, what I would do, I would not necessarily cross out this answer. Again, I know that this is probably not the right answer here, but I would put like a dot here because I'm not sure exactly. So I'm going to deal with that later. Okay, what's gonna decrease the demand for money? Rising level inflation. Well, if there's inflation, then there's a rise in the aggregate price level, and that means that I want to have more money on hand to make my purchases. So definitely not. This is going to decrease the demand for money. Okay, what about an increase in GDP? Well, there's more stuff that's being produced, and again, think of it as, well, you want to buy a lot of this stuff, and so you're going to want more money as well. So this definitely will also increase the demand. An increase in the availability of ATMs. So there's more access to ATMs and technology. So I'm going to hold my money into the bank and withdraw money when I want it. So it's going to decrease the demand for money. That's absolutely true. That's the correct answer. Let's read E and see why that's wrong here. A decrease in interest rates is going to actually increase the quantity demanded for money here. So, you know what, this sounds like it's possibly true, but let me again redraw this graph for you to show you what's exactly going on here. So you here have the quantity of money, and here you have the interest rate. Okay, if there's an increase in interest rates here, so from point A to point B, this is a change in quantity demanded of money here, but it does not decrease the demand. What would actually shift the MD1 to MD2 to the left at every possible point here is going to be not an increase in interest rate, so that's going to be wrong here, but an increase in the availability of ATMs. So if there's an ATM on every single block, again, and that sounds really ridiculous, but let's say banks, for some reason, they put an ATM in every single block, and they don't charge any fees, then it can go a reason we can live in a cashless society. So every day, or maybe every other day, people would withdraw exactly how much they want, maybe $10 or $20, but there would be no reason to have $1,000 cash hidden at home. Again, unless you didn't have any trust in the banking system. Maybe it's December 31st, 1999. But it's this availability of ATMs and increasing technology that, almost ironically, it decreases your demand for money. So now we have this cashless economy as we have more and more technology. Example number 3 here. So if the Fed sells Treasury securities, what happens to the money supply and the equilibrium interest rate? Graph your response. Okay, so you might actually have a Federal Reserve, or not a Federal Reserve, you might have an AP macro question where this might be question number 2, part B, where you want to be able to know this. So again, don't be tripped up by this. It's very straightforward. And I'll do the other example when the Fed buys government securities, what's going to happen. So basically how to know how to draw this graph. There's not a whole lot of trick. It's very self-explanatory right here. So no reason to make your graph tiny. You're going to have tons of space on the FRQ. You're going to have huge pages, and you're going to be able to draw these different things here. So here's the money demand here. Make sure everything is labeled MD, and here's the quantity of money. And you have R, which is interest rate here. And you want to have the money supply curve, which is straight vertical line down here, MS, and ... And this would be Q1 here, and this is R1 here. Now, if the Fed sells government securities, so it sells. Okay, remember the mnemonic I told you to use is sell, shrink here. So the money supply, when the Fed sells securities, okay, the money supply shrinks or decreases and shifts left. Okay, so that's one way. So when the Fed sells government securities, sell, shrink. Okay. Now, again, I want to give you as much ammunition to be able to attack these FRQ questions here. So the 2 other ways that the Fed can shrink the money supply would be the raise the required reserve ratio. Okay, the RRR, the required reserve ratio. And then the third way would be to raise the discount rate. Okay, so raise the discount rate. Now they can actually raise the federal target federal funds rate here. So I'm going to put a 4th category here, but really you can look at this as 1B, an addendum. So when the Fed raises the target, Fed funds rate, when they're doing that, they're actually instructing the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to actually sell more securities. So on the AP exam, if you explain it like that, that's going to be definitely more than you would have to know in order to get the credit. But you want to know how it's actually done. So the Fed doesn't actually raise the federal funds rate. It sets a higher target federal funds rate, and what it does is it's gonna sell securities as a result. So what's gonna excuse me. So what's gonna happen here? The money supply is gonna shift to the left, So let's label this MS1. It's going to be MS2. And so the quantity of money actually decreases here. But, the money supply curve shifts to the left here, and interest rates increase as a result. So let's look at the opposite situation. If the Fed buys Treasury securities, what happens to the money supply and the equilibrium interest rate? Graph your response here. So you want to draw a nice big graph here and call this the quantity of money, and you want to call this the interest rate here. So you have the money demand, MD here, and you also have the money supply. Let's call MD1 here and MS1 here. And this is the equilibrium interest rate here, R1 here. And then this is quantity of money, Q1 right here. So if the Fed buys government securities, try to recall what happens. Well, in the previous slide, we went over previous example, when the Fed sells government securities, it shrinks the money supply. Well, if the Fed buys government securities, it bloats, okay, or it increases the money supply. So the money supply is going to shift to the right here. Okay, this vertical line, you're going to shift it MS2 here, and you're going to have the interest rates go down from R1 to R2. So R decreases. So that makes sense. If there's more money available, then the interest rates are gonna theoretically go down here. So Q2 here. So an increase in money supply when the Fed buys government securities, the money supply curve shifts to the right and lowers the equilibrium interest rate. And so again, for your to be able to fully understand what's going on, when the Fed buys government securities or bonds, another way of saying it is buying bonds or government securities, the money supply curve shifts right. Okay. Or there's an increase in money supply. What are the other ways? If the Fed decreases the required reserve ratio, okay, the money supply would shift to the right. Or if the Fed lowers discount rate, what that's going to do is that's going to shift the money supply curve to the right. And again, as I mentioned before, you can look at this as 4, or you can look at this as 1B. If the Fed lowers the target Fed funds rate. So what's going to happen is if the Fed lowers the target federal funds rate, then they're going to tell the Fed, the New York Fed, to actually sell government securities to get that federal funds rate higher. So the Fed actually sets the target federal funds rate by either buying or selling government securities. Again, maybe a little bit more in-depth than what's required to get the point. For example, if you just say that the Federal Reserve lowers or raises the federal funds rate rather than the target federal funds rate, you're not gonna get marked off. But again, it's good to know exactly how this monetary policy works, whether or not you give too much information or too little information. You want to know the right way of doing it. Thank you for watching educator.com.